June 14, 2024, the day the war in Ukraine took a darker turn. I remember the exact moment I realized we were no longer watching a conflict, but a slow-motion geopolitical train wreck. It wasn't the day Russia launched its invasion in February 2022, nor was it the moment Ukrainian forces retook Kherson in November of that year. No, it was last week, when Moscow flatly rejected yet another Western peace proposal, this one reportedly backed by the United States, Germany, and a coalition of European states, with a dismissive wave of the hand. The Kremlin's response wasn't just a no. It was a "not interested in your terms, not now, not ever." And then Douglas, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Let me tell you what's really happening. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like Russia, under Vladimir Putin, is engaged in a brutal war of conquest in Ukraine, driven by a mix of imperial nostalgia, authoritarian actionism, and a desire to reconstitute the Soviet Union. The West, led by the United States, has generously offered Kyiv military aid, economic support, and multiple off-ramps for peace, all of which Moscow has rejected out of hand. The latest proposal, we're told, was a generous deal that would have seen Ukraine retain most of its territory, receive security guarantees, and even begin the process of EU and NATO accession. Russia's refusal, according to this version of events, proves that Putin isn't interested in peace, he's interested in domination. The data seems to support this. Since the war began, Russia has lost an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 troops, suffered crippling sanctions, and been diplomatically isolated. Yet it presses on. Western intelligence agencies claim that Moscow is preparing for a long war, possibly even a new offensive in the coming months. The Pentagon has released assessments suggesting that Russia's military-industrial complex is now operating at Cold War-era levels of production, churning out tanks, artillery shells, and drones at a pace that outstrips Western support for Ukraine. The media narrative reinforces this. Headlines scream about Russian war crimes, about the genocidal nature of Putin's regime, about the existential threat Moscow poses to Europe. Pundits on CNN and Fox alike warn that if Ukraine falls, the Baltics will be next, then Poland, then Germany. The message is this is a fight for the survival of the free world, and the only acceptable outcome is a Ukrainian victory, however long it takes, whatever the cost. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. It ignores the inconvenient fact that Russia has never been offered what it actually wants. Deconstructing the what Russia really wants. Let's start with the most obvious: what does Russia want? The answer isn't complicated. Moscow has been crystal clear about its demands since before the war even began. In December 2021, the Kremlin presented two draft treaties to the US and NATO, documents that were largely ignored in the West but were taken very seriously in Moscow. The key provisions. 1. No further NATO action eastward, specifically, no membership for Ukraine or Georgia. 2. A legally binding guarantee that NATO would not deploy offensive weapons systems near Russia's borders. 3. A return to the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, which limited the alliance's military presence in former Soviet states. Now, here's where things get interesting. The West's response to these demands was a mix of dismissal and mockery. The Biden administration called them non-starters. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg declared that NATO's door remains open. And European leaders, while paying lip service to diplomacy, made it clear that Ukraine's right to join NATO was not up for negotiation. But here's the Russia wasn't bluffing. When the war began in February 2022, it wasn't because Putin suddenly decided he wanted Kyiv for its borscht. It was because, from Moscow's perspective, the West had spent the last 30 years systematically ignoring Russian security concerns while exiting NATO right up to its borders. The 2014 Maidan coup, the US-backed overthrow of a democratically elected Ukrainian government, the subsequent civil war in Donbass, and the steady flow of Western weapons into Ukraine, all of this was seen in Moscow as an existential threat. And let's be, this wasn't just Putin's paranoia. Even some of the most hawkish US strategists, people like George Kennan, the architect of Cold War containment, warned in the 1990s that NATO action would provoke a Russian backlash. In 1997, Kennan wrote in the New York Times that exiting NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He was right. So when Russia rejected the latest Western peace proposal, it wasn't because Putin is a madman who wants to conquer Europe. It was because the proposal didn't address Russia's core security concerns. It didn't offer neutrality for Ukraine. It didn't remove NATO's military infrastructure from Eastern Europe. It didn't even guarantee that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO in the future. In other words, the West offered Russia a deal that preserved the very conditions that led to the war in the first place. And that's why Moscow said no. The geopolitical why this war is about more than Ukraine. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it can maintain a unipolar world, one where Washington sets the rules, enforces them, and punishes those who break them. This is what political scientists call liberal hegemony. The idea is that by spreading democracy, free markets, and military alliances like NATO, the US can create a world where great power competition is a thing of the past. But here's the Russia and China never signed up for this. From Moscow's perspective, the post-Cold War order wasn't a rules-based international system. It was a US-dominated system where Washington got to decide who was in and who was out. NATO action, color revolutions, regime change wars in Iraq and Libya, the 2014 coup in Ukraine, all of this was seen as proof that the US was not a benign hegemon, but a revisionist power determined to keep Russia weak and dependent. China, meanwhile, has watched all of this with growing alarm. Beijing sees the US as a declining power trying to contain its rise through economic warfare, military encirclement, and ideological subversion. And just like Russia, China has made it clear that it will not accept a world where the US gets to dictate the rules. This is the real geopolitical context of the Ukraine war. It's not just about one country invading another. It's about the death of the unipolar moment and the birth of a multipolar world, one where the US is no longer the sole superpower, but one of several great powers competing for influence. And that's why this war is so dangerous. Because the US isn't just fighting Russia in Ukraine. It's fighting a proxy war against a rising axis of revisionist powers, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, that are increasingly coordinating their efforts to challenge American dominance. The military why the West is losing. Now, let's talk about the military situation. Because here's where things get really ugly. The Western narrative is that Ukraine is holding its own, that Russian forces are exhausted, and that with enough weapons and training, Kyiv can turn the tide. The reality is far more grim. First, the numbers. Russia is currently mobilizing 500,000 new troops for a potential summer offensive. That's on top of the 300,000 to 400,000 it already has in Ukraine. The Russian military-industrial complex is now producing 3 times as many artillery shells as the US and Europe combined. Moscow has also secured a steady supply of drones, missiles, and electronic warfare systems from Iran and North Korea, while China has quietly become a key supplier of dual-use technologies. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of men. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now 43 years old. Kyiv has been forced to lower the conscription age to 25, and there are reports of mass desertions and draft dodging. The country's economy is in shambles, with GDP having contracted by 30% since the war began. And despite billions in Western aid, Ukraine is still losing territory, slowly, but steadily. The most damning statistic? Ukraine is now losing more territory than it's gaining. In 2022, Kyiv retook Kherson and Kharkiv. In 2023, it launched a much-hyped counteroffensive that failed spectacularly, costing tens of thousands of lives and billions in Western equipment. In 2024, the front lines have barely moved, but Russia is advancing in places like Avdiivka and Chasiv Yar, and there are growing concerns that Ukrainian forces may collapse if Western aid is further delayed. And here's the US and Europe don't have the industrial capacity to sustain this war indefinitely. The US is struggling to produce enough artillery shells, let alone advanced weapons like ATACMS or F-16s. Europe is even worse off. Most NATO members are still far below the 2% GDP defense spending target, and their militaries are hollowed out after decades of underinvestment. So what happens when Ukraine runs out of men, money, and munitions? What happens when Russia launches its next offensive and the front lines collapse? That's where Douglas what comes after Ukraine falls. Colonel, if Ukraine collapses, the war won't end. It will escalate. Here's how he sees it playing. 1. Ukraine's If Russian forces break through the front lines, Kiev's government could collapse within weeks. The West would be faced with a do we accept defeat, or do we escalate? 2. Direct NATO. If the US and its allies decide to intervene directly, say, by imposing a no-fly zone or sending in troops, Russia would almost certainly respond with tactical nuclear strikes on NATO supply lines in Poland or Romania. 3. The Baltic. If NATO doesn't intervene, Russia would likely turn its attention to the Baltics, and Moscow has long viewed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as artificial states created by the Soviet collapse, and it has repeatedly warned that it will not tolerate NATO action into these countries. 4. The China. If the US is bogged down in Europe, China would almost certainly move on Taiwan. Beijing has been waiting for this moment for years, and it knows that the US can't fight a two-front war. Now, let me be, this isn't inevitable. But it's a plausible scenario, one that the Pentagon's own wargames have reportedly warned about. And here's the most terrifying: the people in charge don't seem to understand the risks. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants peace. So why is the US still pushing for a war it can't win? Why is the Biden administration sending billions more in aid to Ukraine when it's clear that Kiev is losing? The answer, as always, is domestic politics. Let's start with the military-industrial complex is making a killing. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, these commies are posting record profits, and their stock prices have soared since the war began. The US has already sent $175 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and there's no end in sight. Then there's the ideological factor. The Biden administration, and much of the Washington foreign policy establishment, believes in liberal hegemony. They see the US as the indispensable nation, the guarantor of global order. To them, backing down in Ukraine would be a sign of weakness, a betrayal of American values. And let's not forget the election year politics. Biden is facing a tough re-election campaign, and the last thing he wants is to be seen as losing Ukraine. The Republicans, meanwhile, are divided. Some want to cut aid to Kiev, while others are pushing for even more aggressive measures. But here's the dirty little: no one in Washington actually wants peace. Because peace would mean admitting that the US made a mistake. It would mean acknowledging that Russia has legitimate security concerns. It would mean accepting that the post-Cold War order is over. And that's something the foreign policy blob cannot do. The 3. How this ends. So how does this end? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds on for years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Ukraine becomes a permanent conflict zone, like Korea or Cyprus. The West continues to prop up Kiev with just enough aid to keep it fighting, but not enough to win. Russia, meanwhile, consolidates its gains in the east and south, turning Ukraine into a de facto partition state. This is the least bad outcome, but it's still terrible. It would mean decades of instability in Europe, a permanent Russian military presence on NATO's borders, and a Ukraine that is economically and politically broken. Scenario 2, the Ukrainian collapse. This is the scenario: the Great Power War. This is the nightmare scenario. If NATO intervenes directly in Ukraine, say, by imposing a no-fly zone or sending in troops, Russia would almost certainly respond with tactical nuclear strikes on NATO supply lines in Poland or Romania. The US would then face an impossible: do we back down, or do we escalate to strategic nuclear war? This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because once the nuclear threshold is crossed, there's no going back. The grand strategy why the US is losing the 21st century. So how did we get here? How did the US, the world's sole superpower, end up in a position where it's losing a proxy war to Russia, contained by China, and isolated from much of the global south? The answer lies in grand strategy. For the past 30 years, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that Washington can and should reshape the world in its own image. This has led to a series of disastrous Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. It has also led to a massive overstretch of American power, with the US now maintaining 800 military bases in 80 countries, fighting endless wars in the Middle East, and trying to contain both Russia and China at the same time. The problem? This strategy is unsustainable. The US is a country with $34 trillion in debt, a hollowing out industrial base, and a deeply polarized political system. It can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. And yet, the foreign policy establishment refuses to adapt. This is the same mistake the British Empire made in the 19th century. London spent decades trying to maintain its global dominance, only to bankrupt itself in the process. By the time World War I rolled around, Britain was too weak to defend its empire, and the US and Soviet Union took its place. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, the US is making the same mistakes the British did. What should we do instead? A realist's prescription. So what's the alternative? How do we avoid a catastrophic war while still protecting American interests? Here's what a realist foreign policy would look. 1. End the war in Ukraine on Russia's terms. Now, what most people don't realize is that the war in Ukraine was never just about Ukraine. It's about the future of European security architecture and whether the US will continue to dominate it. The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that NATO action is an unalloyed good, that every former Soviet republic must eventually join the alliance, and that Russia must be permanently weakened. But this is a fantasy. Russia has made it will not tolerate NATO on its borders. Not in Ukraine, not in Georgia, not in Moldova. And if we keep pushing, we will get war not just with Russia, but with a Russia that is increasingly aligned with China, Iran, and North Korea. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 3 decades treating Russia as a defeated power, a has-been that could be ignored or bullied. But Russia is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's a nuclear-armed state with a population of 140 million, a vast territory, and a military that, despite its early struggles in Ukraine, has adapted and improved. The idea that we can bleed Russia dry in a proxy war without consequences is delusional. And yet, that's exactly what the Biden administration has been doing, pouring billions into Ukraine while refusing to negotiate, even as the front lines stagnate and European allies grow weary. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not winning this war. We're not even close. Ukraine is running out of men. Its economy is in shambles. Its infrastructure is being systematically destroyed. And Russia? Russia is mobilizing its economy for total war. It's producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. It's fielding new tanks, new missiles, new drones. And it's doing all of this while under the most severe sanctions regime in history. That should tell you something about the limits of economic warfare. Now, let's talk about the military implications. If the US continues down this path, we're looking at a prolonged conflict that could last years, possibly decades. And what happens then? Do we keep sending weapons indefinitely? Do we risk direct NATO involvement? Because that's where this is headed. The Russians have already struck NATO logistics hubs in Poland. They've sunk a British ship in the Black Sea. They've launched cyber attacks against US infrastructure. At some point, NATO will have to respond. And when it does, we'll be one miscalculation away from a direct clash between nuclear powers. But it's not just about Russia. The bigger picture is China. Beijing is watching this war closely. If the US gets bogged down in a protracted conflict in Europe, China will see an opportunity to move on Taiwan. And unlike Ukraine, Taiwan is an existential interest for the US. If China invades, we will have to respond. And that means fighting a two-front war, one in Europe, one in Asia, against 2 nuclear-armed adversaries. Does anyone in Washington actually believe we can win that? This is why the realist prescription is so urgent. We need to end the war in Ukraine on terms that Russia can accept, not because we like Putin, not because we're surrendering, but because the alternative is far worse. A negotiated settlement would mean Ukraine remains neutral, like Austria during the Cold War. It would mean a frozen conflict in Donbass, with some form of autonomy for the Russian-speaking regions. It would mean Russia keeps Crimea, at least for now. And yes, it would mean Ukraine doesn't join NATO. I know that sounds like appeasement to some. But let's be appeasement is what got us into this mess in the first place. The US spent years exiting NATO eastward, ignoring Russian red lines, and assuming that Moscow would just take it. Well, they didn't. And now we're paying the price. Now, some will argue that if we give in to Russia now, we'll only encourage more aggression. But that's not how great power politics works. Russia's primary concern is security, not conquest. If we offer a face-saving off-ramp, Moscow will take it. And if we don't? Then we're looking at a war that could spiral out of control, with catastrophic consequences for the entire world. The other part of the realist prescription is to pivot to Asia. China is the real long-term threat to U.S. dominance. It's the only country with the economic, military, and demographic potential to challenge American hegemony. And right now, we're wasting resources in Europe that we should be using to deter China in the Pacific. That means shifting our focus to Taiwan, to the South China Sea, to the Philippines. It means strengthening our alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And it means accepting that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense. This is where the establishment gets it wrong. They think the US can do it all, contain Russia, contain China, police the Middle East, and still maintain global dominance. But that's not how power works. You have to prioritize. You have to make hard choices. And right now, the choices we need to end the war in Ukraine, stabilize Europe, and focus on the real challenge, China. But here's the foreign policy blob in Washington doesn't want to hear this. They're still living in the 1990s, when the US was the unipolar superpower and could do whatever it wanted. They don't understand that the world has changed. That Russia and China are no longer weak. That the global South is no longer willing to follow America's lead. And that the US itself is no longer the economic and military juggernaut it once was. So what happens if we don't change course? If we keep doubling down on Ukraine, if we keep provoking Russia, if we keep ignoring the rise of China? Then we're looking at a multipolar world where the US is just one power among many, a world where our influence is diminished, our alliances are strained, and our security is at risk. That's the future we're sleepwalking into. And unless we wake up soon, it's the future we'll get. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about foreign policy, it's about domestic politics, too. The war in Ukraine has become a kind of political litmus test in Washington, a way for the establishment to signal its virtue and its commitment to the liberal international order. But that order is cracking, and the longer we pretend it's not, the worse the reckoning will be. Let me explain why this matters for the American public. Right now, the US is spending tens of billions of dollars on Ukraine, money that could be going to infrastructure, to healthcare, to education, or to shoring up our own defenses in the Pacific. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the US has already committed over $113 billion to Ukraine since the war began, with more on the way. That's not pocket change. That's real money that could be used to address the very real crises at home, crises that are eroding public trust in government and fueling political instability. And yet, the establishment acts as if this is all just a matter of principle. They'll tell you that supporting Ukraine is about defending democracy, about standing up to aggression, about upholding the rules-based order. But here's the uncomfortable: the rules-based order is already dead. It died the moment the US invaded Iraq in 2003, or maybe even earlier, when NATO exited eastward despite promises to the contrary. The global South sees this. They see the hypocrisy. They see the double standards. And they're not buying it anymore. Take India, for example. Here's a country that's supposed to be a key US partner in the Indo-Pacific, a bulwark against China. And yet, India has refused to condemn Russia, has increased its purchases of Russian oil, and has abstained from key UN votes on Ukraine. Why? Because India remembers the Cold War, when the US backed Pakistan and the Soviet Union backed India. They remember the sanctions the US imposed on them after their nuclear tests in 1998. They remember the way the West has treated them as a second-class power for decades. And now, they're not about to pick sides in a war that doesn't benefit them. The same goes for Brazil, for South Africa, for Indonesia. These countries are not going to follow America's lead just because we tell them to. They're going to act in their own interests, and right now, those interests don't align with ours. That's the reality of a multipolar world. And the longer we refuse to accept it, the more isolated we'll become. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this. The war in Ukraine has become a kind of Rorschach test for the American political class. On the right, you have the isolationists, people like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance, who argue that the U.S. should stay out of foreign conflicts and focus on its own problems. On the left, you have the progressives, people like Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna, who argue that the U.S. should be pushing for diplomacy and negotiations, not endless war. And in the middle, you have the establishment, both Democrats and Republicans, who insist that the U.S. must stay the course, that any retreat would be a sign of weakness, that we must support Ukraine until victory. But here's the establishment doesn't have a plan for victory. They don't even have a definition of what victory looks like. Is it pushing Russia out of all of Ukraine, including Crimea? Is it regime change in Moscow? Is it just making sure Ukraine survives as a sovereign state? No one knows. And that's because the establishment is operating on autopilot, repeating the same tired talking points about democracy and sovereignty without any real strategy. Meanwhile, the American public is getting restless. A recent Pew Research poll found that 48% of Americans believe the U.S. is providing too much aid to Ukraine, up from 26% in March 2022. That's a massive shift in public opinion, and it's not hard to see why. People are struggling with inflation, with rising rents, with stagnant wages. They see their tax dollars going to a war that seems to have no end in sight, and they're what's in it for us? The establishment's response? To double down. To call anyone who questions the war a Putin apologist or a Russian asset. To insist that the only acceptable position is unconditional support for Ukraine. But that's not how democracy works. In a democracy, you have to make the case to the public. You have to explain why this war matters, why it's worth the cost, why it's in America's national interest. And right now, the establishment isn't doing that. They're just assuming that the public will go along with whatever they decide. That's a dangerous assumption. Because if the public turns against the war, and I believe they will, sooner rather than later, then the establishment is going to find itself in a very precarious position. They'll be forced to either escalate the conflict, which could lead to a direct confrontation with Russia, or to cut their losses and withdraw, which would be seen as a humiliating defeat. Neither option is appealing, and both could have serious consequences for American power and prestige. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to accept that the world has changed, that the U.S. can't do it all, and that we need to prioritize. That means ending the war in Ukraine through diplomacy, not through endless military escalation. It means pivoting to Asia and focusing on the real long-term China. And it means rebuilding America's domestic strength so that we can compete in this new multipolar world. But here's the establishment doesn't want to do any of that. Because the establishment is invested in the status quo. They're invested in the idea that the U.S. is the indispensable nation, that we can shape the world in our image, that we can afford to police the globe. And they're not going to give that up without a fight. That's why we're seeing such a fierce backlash against anyone who questions the war in Ukraine. That's why we're seeing such a coordinated effort to smear critics as Russian stooges or isolationists. Because the establishment knows that if the public starts asking hard questions, their entire worldview could come crashing down. And that's the real danger here. Not that Russia will win in Ukraine, or that China will take Taiwan, but that the U.S. will continue to sleepwalk into decline, wasting its resources on unwinnable wars while its rivals grow stronger. That's the future we're heading toward if we don't change course. And it's a future that should worry every American. Now, what most people don't realize is that this domestic political battle isn't just about Ukraine, it's about the future of American governance itself. The establishment's refusal to adapt isn't just ideological, it's structural. The U.S. foreign policy machine is a self-perpetuating ecosystem of think tanks, defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and congressional committees that have spent decades reinforcing each other's assumptions. When you have a system where the same people rotate between the Pentagon, the State Department, and the boardrooms of Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, you don't get fresh thinking. You get groupthink. And groupthink is what got us into this mess. Let me explain why this matters for domestic politics. The American public is already exhausted. Inflation, stagnant wages, crumbling infrastructure, these aren't abstract concerns. They're daily realities for millions of people. And yet, the political class keeps telling them that the real priority is sending another $60 billion to Ukraine, a country most Americans couldn't find on a map 5 years ago. That disconnect is dangerous. It's not just that voters are skeptical, it's that they're starting to see the entire foreign policy apparatus as detached from their lives. And when people feel that their government is more concerned with Kiev than Kansas, they stop trusting this system altogether. Here's the uncomfortable: the war in Ukraine has become a litmus test for loyalty within the political and media elite. Question the blank check approach, and you're immediately branded as a Putin apologist or a traitor. Just look at what happened to Tulsi Gabbard after she dared to suggest that diplomacy might be worth pursuing. Or the way the Washington Post smeared Rand Paul as a Russian asset for opposing NATO action. This isn't debate, it's dogma. And dogma is the enemy of strategy. But the cracks are starting to show. In the 2022 midterms, candidates who ran on ending the war outperformed those who towed the establishment line. In Ohio, J.D. Vance won his Senate race in part by calling out the folly of endless aid to Ukraine. In Arizona, Kari Lake made opposition to the war a central plank of her campaign. Even in deep blue districts, progressive Democrats like Ro Khanna and Ilhan Omar are breaking ranks, arguing that the money would be better spent at home. This isn't a partisan issue, it's a populist one. And populism, for all its flaws, is a sign that the public is waking up to the fact that their leaders are more interested in global hegemony than in their well-being. Now, the establishment's response to this dissent has been double down. The Biden administration has framed the war as an existential struggle between democracy and autocracy, as if the fate of the free world hinges on whether Bakhmut stays in Ukrainian hands. That's not just hyperbole, it's a deliberate strategy to make criticism of the war seem unpatriotic. But here's the: most Americans don't buy it. Poll after poll shows that while they support Ukraine's right to defend itself, they don't support endless escalation. A Wall Street Journal survey from last November found that 55% of Americans oppose further aid to Ukraine, up from 40% just a year earlier. That's not isolationism, that's common sense. So what happens next? I see 3 possible scenarios, each with its own risks and consequences. The first is the establishment's preferred more of the same. Another $60 billion, another year of stalemate, another round of escalation until we're one miscalculation away from direct conflict with Russia. This is the path of least resistance for the political class because it doesn't require them to admit they were wrong. But it's also the most dangerous path, because it assumes that Russia will continue to absorb losses without retaliating in ways that could spiral out of control. Remember, Putin isn't some irrational madman, he's a rational actor with a high pain threshold. And when rational actors are backed into a corner, they do unpredictable things. The second scenario is a negotiated settlement, forced by domestic political pressure. This could happen if the 2024 election delivers a mandate for change, whether through a Trump victory, a progressive insurgency in the Democratic Party, or simply a wave of anti-establishment candidates who refuse to play along. The problem is that the longer the war drags on, the harder it becomes to negotiate. Every day that passes, more territory changes hands, more lives are lost, and more pride gets invested in the outcome. By the time the US is ready to talk, Russia may not be. And even if they are, the terms will be far worse than they would have been 2 years ago. The third scenario is the most: a sudden collapse of American support, triggered by an unexpected crisis. Imagine a major terrorist attack on US soil, or a financial meltdown, or a domestic political upheaval that forces Washington to turn inward. In that moment, the war in Ukraine would become a luxury the US can no longer afford. The withdrawal would be chaotic, humiliating, and likely embolden Russia to press its advantage. But it's not impossible. History is full of examples of great powers overextending themselves and then retreating in disorder. Just look at Britain after Suez or the US after Vietnam. Here's what worries me: none of these scenarios end well for American credibility. The establishment's insistence on framing this as a moral crusade rather than a strategic competition has boxed us into a corner. If we escalate and lose, we look weak. If we negotiate from a position of weakness, we look weak. And if we walk away, we look weak. That's the paradox of hegemony. Once you start down the path of global policing, every retreat becomes a defeat. But there's another way to look at this. What if the real strength isn't in clinging to a fading unipolar world, but in adapting to a multipolar one? What if the US could lead by example by rebuilding its infrastructure, revitalizing its industry, and demonstrating that democracy can still deliver for its people? That's the kind of power that lasts. Not the power of bombs and sanctions, but the power of a society that works. The problem is that the people in charge don't want to hear that. They'd rather keep fighting the last war literally and figuratively than admit that the world has changed. And that's why, in the end, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about whether America can still govern itself, or whether it's become a country where the elites are so detached from reality that they'd rather risk everything than admit they were wrong.